This episode of the BeanCast is brought to you by Methodify by Delvinia. Get real-world customer feedback in hours, not weeks. Schedule your demo and get a free $20 Amazon gift card. Go to methodify.it/BeanCast and Methodify it today. Bandwidth provided by Recursive Squirrel Interactive. Visit them on the web at recursivesquirrel.com. Episode 597, White Envelopes. Monday, June 15th, 2020. It's time for this week's edition of the BeanCast, a weekly discussion about the news and issues facing marketers today. I'm your host, Bob Norp. Thanks for joining us. Maybe the upfronts won't be going away, but they may be operating under very different rules in the future. The ANA is pushing for a number of changes, including a permanent shift to the fall. What will it all mean for us? We'll discuss. Also confronting racial biases in influencer marketing, the tepid response by brands to a racist remark, why the esports ad shift never happened, plus this week's Fair, Fail, Foul. That's the lineup. Let's meet tonight's panel. Thanks for joining us for this week's BeanCast. I'm Bob Norp, and with me on the panel for this evening, we start with the editor-in-chief of Muse by Clio. Mr. Tim Nudd is here. Hi, Tim.
Hey, Bob. Thanks a lot for having me back.
Always a pleasure to have you on the program. Now, next up, she's an independent message strategist and noted keynote speaker, the founder of the Red Thread, Ms. Tamsen Webster. Hi, Tamsen.
Hey, so good to be back.
It's always good to be back. It's good to be back anywhere these days, but we'll get into that
That's
as we talk. And where there's one Webster, we always try to double our money with a second. The Senior Vice President of Strategy and Marketing for Edison Research, Mr. Tom Webster, joins us. Hi, Tom.
Hey, Bob, and I am in the same location as Tamsen. Corona be damned.
Well, at least she got that going for you. Well, let's talk about the upfronts that are going on, or not going on, I guess is a more appropriate way to talk about them. The ongoing struggle of the networks and advertisers to come to terms on some sort of upfront agreements this year has taken an interesting turnabout. The ANA is now officially pushing for a permanent delay of the annual event until the fall, effectively turning it into a calendar year happening. Now, Tim, maybe you can give me some perspective on this. This isn't just about coronavirus fears, is it? So what are the driving forces here, and how does it, or could it, fundamentally change the way we approach television media buying? What's so big about moving it to the fall and making it more of a calendar year approach?
Well, I mean, to start off, it really is a mess. I mean, everything's a mess, but the TV marketplace is a super mess. Brands don't know what to do with their budgets this year. Networks don't know what they're going to be able to show in the fall or in 2021. So, it's a big problem. But I think what we've learned in the past few months is that, these problems that we're having these last couple months can actually open up some opportunities, and I think the ANA is looking at it that way. When your behavior has to change, sometimes you end up creating a better way.
The way you're describing it sounds like this has been a long time coming, and that coronavirus or the whole situation going on with the world pandemic is just giving them the opportunity to make true something that they've wanted to have happen for quite a long time. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. It's been happening. People have been complaining about the upfronts as long as I've been covering the business, so 20 years plus. Everyone, agrees it's antiquated. It should change, but it's so big. I mean, I think a third of the $70 billion spent on TV ads every year gets spent at the upfronts. So trying to change that system, is kind of like trying to steer the Titanic. But I think just to set the stage a little bit, Hollywood's obviously halted production of shows. Almost all live sports has been canceled, so that's an enormous effect on the supply side. On the buyer side, there's obviously incredible instability. A lot of major industries are pretty much in crisis. Hospitality, travel, entertainment, retail. Whereas some other categories are thriving. So you've got all this instability there. But so far, I think something like 10 billion in TV ad revenue has already been lost. So it's obviously a serious thing. And I think what the ANA is doing is saying, well, this year the upfronts are going to have to change. So maybe we can change them, to our benefit. And so I think doing something, for the fall for a calendar year, I think it does two things. First of all, it would formalize the process. I think there's some concern among the brands, right now that the upfronts, there may not be a formalized upfront at all this year. And I think they want an upfront. I think that would put pressure on the networks to sort of commit to sort of formally what they're planning and add some clarity to what's obviously a really unstable and unclear situation. And then, calendar year marketplace would offer some, I think, efficiencies for marketers in terms of budgeting. It's the whole TV season starting in September and going to May is just a really kind of weird relic, and it's hard. I think it's tough for brands to budget around that. Straddling 2 calendar years. I think it goes back to actually when new cars were generally roll out.
That's what I was reading. I was reading it was all based on the car dealers or car manufacturers introducing the new model years sometime in the fall. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was in the 50s or 60s. So I think I think the ANA, there's 1,600 brands in the ANA, and I think they've got some clout here to try to put some pressure on the networks, and they've already been doing that for the past bunch of years, trying to get the networks to offer sort of better approach in terms of I think they want more flexibility in general. They need more data from the networks than they're getting around audience targeting, things like that. I think they're using this crisis though to kind of try to squeeze the networks a little bit, and I'm sure it'll happen the other way too. But I don't think it sounds like some of the networks didn't even know about that the ANA was going to release this, so that's never a good sign.
Never a good sign when you're left in the dark and your partner comes out with a statement like this.
I know, you gotta love it.
Tom, to be clear, and maybe I'm misunderstanding things, but it sounds like the ANA is not doing this out of a desire to spend less on television. They're doing it more from a standpoint of having more control over when and how they run their ads, as opposed to being locked into seasonal schedules. Am I right in that understanding, or am I missing something?
I think you're right, Bob, because one thing that we have noticed in our research at Edison over the past 3.5 months is, media consumption of all kinds. I liken it to a snow globe. When you have some kind of a, discontinuous event, a major disaster, let's say a global pandemic would qualify.
Right. We happen to have one of those.
We happen to have one, and I have one right here, as Julia Child would say. We've got one already prepared. What that does is it kind of shakes up the snow globe, and all of those flakes, all of those kind of audience flakes, they settle in very different places. And when all of this started, we saw some real declines in radio. We saw some temporary declines in things like podcasting. TV viewing was all messed up. Netflix was completely different. And if anything, I think at least part of this might be just a flight to safety. And maybe I think when that snow globe gets shaken up and when it gets back to normal, not everything's going to go back the way it was. That's the most important thing, I think, for a media buyer to understand, is that some things will go back the way they were, but some of the new habits that we have picked up over the last 3 or 4 months are going to stick. And if I'm a media buyer and I'm savvy about media research, I'm going to want a bit more of a window into that before I want to start committing a bunch of money in advance of a project.
That's an interesting side point to all this. Tamsen, what Tom's describing here is basically sounds to my ear like somebody trying to hedge their bets. And it's not necessarily about pushing an agenda for changing the upfronts, which it is to a certain extent, but it's more about just hedging your bets on well, we don't want to commit the dollars yet. We want the flexibility to drop out in case you don't get a plan, networks. So how much of this kind of how much of this horse trading that's going on right now is mainly about trying to make sure that the interests of the brands are protected in case this continues to drag out for another year or two?
I'm going to imagine that a majority of it is. I mean, I think I completely agree with Tom when he says this is a flight to safety. I mean, businesses and particularly managers of national brands, they're always looking to minimize risk. And we are in the midst of, a little bit of risk right now, just a tiny bit. And
Just a little.
And just, tiny bit. I think there's also there's all sorts of folks, I'm just going to say that neutrally, that are taking advantage of this big disruption to push different agendas. And so I think when that snow globe gets shaken, it is an opportunity to say, well, if this is changing, well, why not change this other thing? And so in the midst of that, if you have a lot of national brands that their fiscal year is a calendar year, I can see that even for that reason, that's a good time to start shifting and thinking of it differently. It allows them to plan, to associate their buying planning with their fiscal planning a little bit better. And generally, that's usually a more efficient process for any company to engage in.
Tim, talk to me a little bit more about the calendar year part of this. Practically, what does that mean? I'm watching this and I'm going, this doesn't seem to be changing much about the way the upfronts are done. We're still talking about making a commitment for an annual buy of advertising against programming. It's just happening in the fall so that it begins in the January calendar year. How much does that disrupt the way that we do things as opposed to just move things around on the calendar?
Well, I think you just compress the timeline a little bit more too. Like when you're making decisions in May, for the following year, essentially, like there's a lot of sort of haggling that goes on, I think, around third quarter buys in the second, the second year after, when you make a deal in May and then a year later, heading into the third quarter, there's a lot of revisions going on. I think that's happening now, in particular to the commitments advertisers made last year. So, I think there's less, you don't have to project as far out if you did it in the fall for a calendar year. So I think that's, part of what's going on here. But, it's going to mess with the networks too. The networks are still very much, certainly the broadcast networks are very much still in their sort of September to May timeframe. So, they want to get commitments further out from the marketers. So, I think these questions are, the inefficiencies of the system have been there for a long time, but the sheer force of the broadcast network schedule has just sort of kept the status quo in place. I do think it would help brands actually to do a calendar year thing, but I think the networks are going to resist that.
Well, it's crazy. I mean, I can see why the networks are trying to reduce risk as well. I mean, my sister is a TV screenwriter. She wrote for The Handmaid's Tale. Now she's the showrunner for the new J.J. Abrams show on HBO. And what's been really interesting talking with her is just that I mean, everything's stopped. I mean, the writers' rooms are working, but they don't know when these shows are going to get produced again. And, if I'm sitting and watching like America's Funniest Videos with my kids, they're prominently showing right now that, these episodes that are soon to run out were filmed in February. Well, these shows are not going to get filmed anytime soon. So it's going to be interesting to see what the networks actually have to produce. And I think what we're going to see is just that there's a very real tension here between the networks trying to reduce their risk because they don't know when they can go back into production again, and brands trying to reduce their risk, saying, I don't want to be putting my ads on something where it's reruns of America's Funniest Videos from 2002. So I think it's going to be an interesting thing to see develop.
And Tamsen, while I have you, so talk to me a little bit about the trickle-down effect here as well, because we talk about the effect on brands and the effect on the networks, but I guess it would be wise to say effect on the agencies. But as you move down into the agency ranks, having that flexibility on run dates, flexibility of messaging, flexibility of getting ads out, how does that disrupt the entire creative process and strategic process of planning out an ad campaign?
Oh, good Lord. I would like to say that I have absolutely no idea, and I don't. But since you've asked me the question, let me tell you where my instinct goes, having had to do this before, but not in any other situations like this. I mean, I think this is an opportunity for brands to really be thinking. You kind of have to think along two tracks. One is, how can I really focus on the core message that we're trying to get out there, and think about what are the messages that are in essence evergreen, what are campaigns that you can put together that will work kind of self-contained, that aren't dependent necessarily on what they're being shown against or what time of year. I think that's one track for them to be thinking on. That's going to be a way to minimize the risk. So making sure that they're moving a message forward, they're moving their brand story forward, even though everything else is changing. That's one track. The other track I would be thinking about is, well, how can you draw relevance to, if you can draw relevance to what your brand does, and that really is the first step. How can you do that given this time? I mean, I think we saw the first wave of pandemic ads, in these uncertain times, and we've all seen the supercuts of those ads put together. But I think there's been some very interesting evolutions of ad campaigns since then, really taking advantage of this, of what limited production value folks have with them. I mean, I think Progressive Insurance, for instance, has been very interesting about how they've quickly adapted to clearly think like videos that I think were essentially shot in the actors' homes. So, I mean, there is always change in the marketplace. And I think we're always fooling ourselves to think that there's ever a normal year, that there's ever a normal quarter, that there's even ever a normal week. So I think the folks that are going to be most successful in the long term are the ones that are very, very solid on what that core messaging is, so that they can kind of keep coming back to it. And because that message is firm, think about how they can draw from what's happening in the moment, and in a way that has integrity, draw what's happening in the moment back to whatever that core message is.
Tim, what Tamsen's describing here sounds a lot like what the agencies are doing right now, which is they're basically shedding a lot of talent out of the ranks, or putting people on furlough, getting down to a lean machine that's generating out just the ads that can be generated out for the needs of the moment, and reusing a lot of old content. They've got somebody who's a brand steward, somebody who's making sure that the brand message is on track, and that they don't need a whole bunch of bodies to generate a lot of content. Is this the future even after COVID, even after the pandemic is gone? I mean, is this the ultimate, the end game of what's been going on in the agency world for the last decade, 2 decades?
Well, you're right that it's a very difficult time for the agency world. I don't think it's necessarily the future, but I do think, to what Tom said earlier, I think there's going to be learnings from this that we aren't going to go back to how it was before. So, the being forced into a box, you sort of learn better how to play in that box, and you learn those skills better. And I think, when live production comes back, and it will come back, a lot of brands will flock to that, but they will also flock to it knowing that they have other ways to express what they're trying to say, and whether that's animation or even stock, or they're gonna be flexing muscles that they didn't know they had. And I think creatively it'll just expand their options. And I think it will change what agencies do going forward. Probably will change what they look like in terms of staffing and other things. I mean, when you learn how to save money and still create something great, and I do think some agencies are doing some good work right now, even within the smaller box that they're playing in. I think that has the potential to sort of change the way agencies operate for sure. But I don't think it's not like the normal that we're living in now is the normal we're going to be in when this is over. I mean, we're gonna want to shoot commercials when we get back from this. So I think it'll be a combination. But I do think agencies are learning, and not just in the creative work. They're learning, all over the place how to operate differently. I think it's been well documented how well a lot of these companies are functioning with remote workers, and myself personally, I mean, I'm obviously not traveling, and we're able to produce at the Clio's, a lot of, we're actually expanding our content offering and doing a bunch of new stuff ourselves. So I think every company is kind of going through this, where you sort of learn how to do new things, and you keep those on even when you get the potential to do the old stuff back. So I think it's it's a tough time for agencies at the moment, of course. I mean, there's been incredible contraction there. Hopefully their agencies will come back and prove their worth and be able to staff up again once this is over. But you're probably right. I think we're maybe looking at a smaller overall ecosystem.
Bob, just real quick on something that Tim said earlier, which I think is really dead on. I mean, so much of the upfronts is based on kind of a seasonal system. Whether it's when new cars come out or whatever. It almost seems quaint today, given the amount of non-seasonal content, just sort of continuously rolling content that we get in other channels. And I do a lot of new fronts and pod fronts and all kinds of things, and these tend to be smaller, nimbler events, multiple times a year, multiple cities. There's sort of less pressure on them, and I think in some ways people like that, and I wonder if a lot of the kind of the media buying function of a lot of the big agencies, they're kind of these like arcane wizards that have been behind purple drapes for years and years and years, and they kind of like the way it is. And I wonder if what we have been going through over the past few months has weirdly represented a good opportunity for some of the more progressive voices at the ANA to maybe steer the battleship a little.
That may be true entirely. I mean, I think that's a real good insight into what's happening right now. I think that there is an opportunity for a lot of people who've been advocating for change to step into the ring and make these changes finally. So, well, it'll be an interesting landscape to look for over the coming months. Well, we're going to talk next about influencer marketers and the implied racial biases that go on within that particular segment of the marketplace. Not that there isn't that type of bias in a lot of different segments in the marketplace, but this one in particular, we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But first, I want to talk about our sponsor, Methodify by Delvinia, and give you or someone you know another chance to get a $20, that's right, $20 Amazon gift card just for checking them out. Now, you know what it's like to be in this situation right now. If you're working for a brand, you've got real people just like you or your coworkers or employees making decisions. And if you're all making those decisions right now, you're doing so under a whole lot of stress, talking to consumers who are also under a whole lot of stress. And if you say one wrong thing in this powder keg of TNT explosive badness, you could unleash a social media firestorm against your brand, and you don't want that. Just adds another headache to what's going on right now. So this is where our sponsor, Methodify by Delvinia, can help you out. Methodify collects real feedback from your actual customers on concepts or creative before you release it to the world. And the whole process, the entire process, will take you hours, not days. Now, Methodify gives insight professionals and senior marketing people the information they need to power better decisions that will protect their brands and themselves. Methodify has been used to test digital creative for a number of brands in a lot of different categories during this pandemic, all to make sure that their ad messaging wasn't tone deaf. Now, it was invaluable information for them, and Methodify can do the same for you. Actual customer feedback is a game changer because right now brands that wait and see and just take their time and hope for the best are going to wind up making costly mistakes. Now, of course, Methodify and me, we both want you to connect with your customers. We want you to build relationships. We want you to build trust, build fans. But we also want you to test everything. It's the smart thing to do, and Methodify can get you started today. Now, to find out more about Methodify and to set up a demo, just Methodify it. go to methodify.it/BeanCast. That's methodify.it/BeanCast. And as a way of saying thanks, every BeanCast listener who signs up and completes a demo will receive a $20 Amazon gift card just for your time. And don't keep this to yourself. Tell everybody about it. Go to your friends, go to your coworkers, go to associates, go to that person you met at a conference last year that you haven't talked to. Give you a reason to talk to them again. So go to methodify.it/BeanCast, and we thank them very much for their support of our program. Now, Adweek ran a thought piece this past week from influencer agency executive Stefania Pamponi. I think I got that name right, Stefania Pamponi, that both admitted to her own agency's racial biases in doing influencer deals and challenged brands and fellow agency execs to do better. Tamsen, obviously, this is not an easy issue. It's a complex one, many-faceted issue. Is dealing with it as easy as simply doing more deals with people of color? Or is it something more complex in the way that we do business as a whole in the influencer marketing space?
Oh my Lord. I
gave you the easy one, Tamsen.
Yeah, exactly. I think I'm wholly unqualified as a white person to be fully answering this question.
Let me caveat that, because it's just like, I think that it's important for us to realize that Tamsen is not a person of color, but at the same time, this is about people who are not of color confronting their own problems. And I think that that's why I think you are qualified to talk about this. I think you are a qualified individual to speak on this subject. So with that, take it away.
I think your question at its simplest was, is this as easy as simply doing more deals with people of color? Of course not. Yes, that needs to be part of it, but if that's the only thing that we're doing, then I think that we're falling very much into the performative ally camp, and that's not helping. Obviously, we're all trying to figure a lot of this out right now, and there is a delicate balance between seeking to promote and amplify and find the answers not within ourselves as people who are not of color, but in the community of Black and Indigenous people of color, without expecting them to do all of the work, because they're already carrying a far greater burden than they ever should. So I think what that brings me to is that this is an opportunity for a level of dialogue and a level of conversation and a level of reckoning, both self and otherwise, that I've never seen in my lifetime. And I think that's where it has to start. But I can't even begin to say where the answers are, other than to echo where the answers are in so many of these issues that we're talking about right now, which is to find the voices of Black and Indigenous people of color, amplify those folks, step forward and question when those folks are not being included, call people on the exclusionary and even implied biases that we've got, and understand that the only way that we can fix this is for it to feel unfair for a bit. And on that point, I don't want to misquote Tom, because he said he has put this beautifully. So I'm actually going to throw it to Tom here, because Tom, you've had some insight, and I think it was around a different issue where you talked about the appropriate and what's necessary to correct an unjust system. So what did you say, so I don't misquote you?
Yeah, I mean, fairness will never correct a systemic bias, because if I get paid $1 and you get paid 50 cents, that's unequal and that's unfair. And so then, if I pay you $1 and me $1, that seems like it's equal, but then I have $2 and you have $1.50, and you can keep sustaining that forever and ever and ever, and it will asymptotically approach something near fairness decades from now. But you cannot correct a bias system through fairness. You have to be unfair in the other direction to actually do it. And I agree with Tamsen. It's not simply about doing more deals with people of color. The problem is that there aren't people of color on this show. There aren't enough people of color in my company. There aren't enough people of color in the agencies that are doing these deals, because if they were, these things would not slide by without another thought as they are right now. They wouldn't be something that they had to think about. They would simply be thought about because systemically the system was not biased against people of color. And it's a structural issue. It's an HR issue at the agency level, such that it's not about just, well, let's do more deals with color. That shouldn't have to be something that you think about after the thought, because those voices should already be represented in the boardrooms of those agencies. And the problem is that they're not. And the only way to fix that is not equality, it's unfairness in the other direction. Otherwise, it's going to be a long time before things are quote unquote equitable.
I found it interesting that when this author of this piece, when she was being so forthright about her own agency's lack of responsiveness toward the African-American community in terms of working with influencer deals, she seemed to pass the buck a little bit to the brands. She took ownership for the way the agency dealt with the issue, but essentially they said the brands were pushing them in that direction, and they just felt it was easier to not buck the system and to just go with what they wanted, what they felt was the easiest, most expedient way to please the client. And I'm wondering, Tim, is it possible for agencies to affect this kind of change if brand partners are the problem, or is that just passing the buck and the brand partners aren't really the problem? It comes down to the agencies making the wrong recommendations. I mean, where do you see the real problem lying in this scenario?
Well, I'm sure the problem lies with both of them.
But I think true.
I think it'll, it is on the agencies to say, this is not okay. This is what we believe in, and this is our process. And we want you, we want you to be on board with it, or, we're not going to work with you. And I understand, that's not easy, certainly in this environment for an agency to say, but, that's the sacrifice we're talking about here. I also would say that, I think a lot of this is about process, about setting up processes that can actually make this stuff work. I mean, to me, obviously this goes far beyond influencers to, any company that has the ability to amplify Black voices and is not doing as good of a job as it could. For example, at Muse, we've always welcomed Black voices. We've always been thrilled to have Black writers publish essays on our site. But we never had a proper system for doing that. We didn't have a process for recruiting Black writers. And so, when you don't have that process, if you don't have that system, then the status quo obviously sort of tends to perpetuate. So, I think whether you're an agency or a brand, I think it's very easy to be pleased with yourself for sort of being passively non-racist. And I think now we're sort of belatedly and painfully realizing that, you have to be actively anti-racist and for real change to occur. And I think setting up a process that is constantly monitoring that is critical. And we're trying to do that. And I think if influencer agencies and brands did the same, I think it'll be a way to make sure that this isn't just a passing moment.
I like the way you put that, to put it into a process, an active process of seeking out voices of different genders, different races, different ethnic backgrounds. I mean, make it a priority in the organization to go that way. I know I was sitting here thinking about all the way that I recruit guests for the show, and I do try to do that, but I don't have a process in place that actively targets that level of diversity within the guest population that I put on the show. And I, as part of that, I was thinking of the PR representatives who get in touch with me, and I can't remember one PR representative who's gotten in touch with me recently who has been pitching to me an African-American man or woman. And I'm wondering how much of that is bias and how much of that is, I don't know why is that happening? I mean, do you as a publisher, you probably have a lot of PR people trying to get their their talent on the site, get their talent or their articles or their creative pieces on your site. Are they being?
But the system. I mean, I know this is you're directing this to Tim, but I mean, the whole system is biased, Bob. That's the problem. I mean, from the ground up, there aren't Black and Indigenous people of color. There aren't enough women in the system to begin with. And so that's part of the issue. So, I mean, I think Tim's right to say, well, it's not just in the agencies, it's not just in the brands. I mean, it's in the bedrock of our society that certain people, namely white men, are elevated more than anybody else. And that's what's promoted. I mean, you have to actively go against the easy thing. You have to look, and as Tom was saying, it has to be unfair. And it's going to feel super unfair to the people who have had that power for a very long time. But I don't think we can just say, well, I'm not getting presented with them. I mean, I see only I see this in a very, very small way when it comes to the keynote speaker market, when people are saying, oh, well, we want women, but there just, aren't as many of them, or they're not as good, or whatever. But there's research that shows, I just saw this research out of BYU that shows that, I mean, just systemically, even if you're just talking about women in a room full of men, that you need 4 women in a group of 5 in order for a consensus vote to go in favor of what the women are arguing for. And so and that isn't just from a gender bias. It isn't just from what women are saying. It is baked in from society from the ground up. And if I feel like some piece of that as a woman, I can't even imagine what it feels like to be a person of color in this country and experiencing the same thing. So it is on us, whatever level of privilege that each of us have. And as 4 white people sitting on this show right now, we have a lot, let me put it that way, to actively take what we've got and actively look for those opportunities to right the imbalances wherever we can. And that means we have to do the work of finding it. We can't just wait for people to put them in front of us. We have to break through and say, I'm looking at my list of people that I always read and whatever, and it doesn't look how it needs to look. I mean, we cannot take the easy answers here, and the temptation is going to be strong, but we just cannot do it. Not if each of us individually and collectively are people who truly believe that whatever we put out there needs to be an accurate representation of the equal value that different people, no matter what they look like, no matter what their gender is, no matter what their sexual orientation or identification is, their voice has value. And that means that those of us whose voices have been valued more systemically, we have to step back and use whatever power we have to bring those people forward.
Yeah, that was really well put. Bob, I would also say, you're asking about people pitching me. I mean, yes, I can sit back. I get more essays pitched to me than I know what to do with, and I could easily just take that stack and just work from that. But obviously, it's not going to include. I cover an overwhelmingly white industry, and so if we don't do the work editorially to raise those voices up and to go seek them out, they're not going to get heard. We can't just wait for them to come to us. It's I think one of the lessons of the last few weeks is we think that sympathy and believing in a cause is enough, and it's about action and process, I think.
Yeah.
Well, and can I go on a very tiny rant here, Bob? I promise.
Sure, please do.
A lot of this, I think, the influencer marketing business, such as it is, I think, has always been under pressure to quantify itself. What's the ROI of this? How can you quantify this? And so they make spreadsheets, and those spreadsheets show that these 5 blonde white influencers on Instagram are moving a lot of product and these other ones aren't. And so they optimize. And so more dollars go to those 5 women, and so on and so on and so on. And eventually you fall into what I like to call the optimization trap, where, by continually favoring what looks better in your spreadsheet than to the expense of other things, you create this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Oh my
it
God,
looks like
you're
data.
you're describing direct marketing. You're describing direct marketing to a T. I mean, we basically tested ourselves into white envelopes. I can see the irony of that statement. We tested
100%.
ourselves into white envelopes, and it's just like it's the most effective, efficient way to communicate the credit card offer. But you're brand blind. You have no color to the actual message.
That's 100% correct and a great analogy. And my concern is that you've got people believing that they are data-driven influence marketers, but they don't really understand data.
Oh, such a good point. Such a good point. Well, we've got one more topic of racism to talk about, but this one's a little bit easier, if more disgusting. In the wake of Fox News commentator Tucker Carlson's racist tirade that seemed to imply that the government needed to put down the recent protests before, and this is paraphrasing a bit, before they come for you, they meaning black people, major sponsors such as Papa John's and MyPillow pulled their ads and issued strongly worded press statements denouncing what was said. But a piece from Brian Steinberg at Variety reveals that while these sponsored pulled ads from the show, Fox lost no revenue since the brands simply moved their dollars to other shows on the network. Tim, I'm going to go to you on this. Is this something that brands will be able to get away with for much longer? It seems like this is the kind of thing that gets called out pretty quickly, and it's not going to just fade away like it has in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I hope they don't. I mean, first of all, kudos to Sleeping Giants and the other activist groups who spend a lot of time, for no pay to kind of make this their cause and to track this stuff down. I mean, I don't know. I think, my hope is that, the current surge that we're seeing in true recognition among white people about, what Black Lives Matter really means and why it's important and how racism is systemic. I think that surge of recognition will hopefully, make it more difficult for advertisers, in general to support racist programming and, make it more difficult for them to defend themselves when they do. And so, I guess the particulars of this are frustrating where they're just moving their ads to another show. But I think hopefully this, raising of awareness right now, over the long term, I think hopefully the, racist media does begin to feel the financial implications of that, even if they're not, at the moment. What frustrated me particularly about this story was that Fox News, made a point of saying that they'd lost no revenue. I mean, they didn't have to make a point of that. They're saying that to make the argument or to make people aware that their rhetoric doesn't cost them anything. And I think, to me, the hope is that one day, it will cost them, financially, even if right now advertisers feel free to sort of hop around. I think we're just at the beginning of what will hopefully be, pretty fundamental change. And I think you're right that I think brands are not going to be able to get away with supporting somebody like that or the network that they, that houses them.
Yeah, I think that's for me, that was, you said it best. I mean, this whole idea that somehow they had to point out that they took no harm, no hurt from this effort, that even though the show itself wasn't getting the sponsors, the dollars hadn't left the network. Tom, is this just something that's unique to the Fox News audience that, they, because of the rhetoric that's going on in the programs that are on that network, they're able to get away with something like this, and that brands are able to get away with it on this particular network? I mean, what is it about that equation that's just so troubling?
I think a lot of people don't really understand the role of Fox Network of Fox News in this country, to be honest. And we've done a number of different studies on media bias, right? And most Americans believe that most of the major news networks and kind of news outlets have a liberal bias to some degree or another. You have some CNN, MSNBC, they sort of wear it on their sleeve. But they all are sort of perceived to one degree or another to have a slight liberal lean. Amongst the major news networks, Fox has that lane kind of to itself. And, there is a percentage of people in this country that are going to vote for Trump in the next election It's north of 30%, I can assure you, no matter what. And you've got some other outlets like OANN and some other kind of online networks, but in terms of major outlets, Fox has that lane completely to themselves. And you can look at programs like Tucker Carlson clearly has said racist things on that show, disgusting things on that show, without question. But there are plenty of Americans who look at Fox News, just the news portion of it, as the only source of positive information about what the American government and administration is doing, amidst a relentless drumbeat from the other networks that there's nothing positive happening. And so all of that is to say that on the one hand, you have a brand, you mentioned Papa John's and MyPillow. Papa John's has had some trouble with racism, with Papa John himself, John
Yes,
Schnatter,
they
stepped
have.
down.
Yes, they have.
They brought Shaquille O'Neal onto their board, so it's a very troubling thing for them. And not only did they pull off of Tucker Carlson, they immediately pulled back from opinion/editorial shows. Period. But MyPillow did not. MyPillow is still advertising on Tucker Carlson. MyPillow is all over Fox News because MyPillow is appealing to that percentage of Americans who want to be cradled in the comforting whiteness of a MyPillow. And that's not going to change because that's a significant swath of the American public. And Fox, in some ways, is the only way to reach a lot of those people, and they buy things. So, the market's going to determine that. And you can say, the market's really going to punish MyPillow. I don't know about that. There might be 30% of the whole country that now wants to buy a MyPillow and now wants to invest in gold and now wants to buy 90 days worth of Survivor rations. I don't know. But the point is, it's not a small chunk of America. And for some brands, that's a fertile chunk to mine. So I think the market is going to determine all of that. And again, let me reiterate what Tucker Carlson said was disgusting.
Yeah, and good points all. Speaking of markets and movements and things that we predicted and things that don't come true and things that are kind of troubling, we all predicted here on this show, on news magazines and industry pubs all over the place, that with the absence of live sports, much of those dollars would somehow magically migrate, at least temporarily, to the esports arena. Esports could continue broadcasting, could continue playing. They could do all the things that regular sports couldn't under the COVID quarantine. But a new analysis out in SI last week shows that didn't exactly happen like that. Reasons include everything from different audiences to technical considerations. Tom, was all this simply a result of esports apologists' over-exuberance, or is this more a failure of brands to appreciate the opportunity and act on it? Why is it that the shift that everybody predicted might happen didn't actually occur?
Wow. Okay. There's a lot to unpack here, actually, I think.
I think so.
Yeah. So, the first thing I will say is that in our kind of annual flagship media survey product, the Infinite Dial, we've been tracking esports. We've been tracking the percentage of Americans 12 plus who watch them, the percentage who play them and broadcast them. And, a year ago, 15% of Americans 12 plus said that they had ever watched video games, basically played on TV or on Twitch, or, basically observed someone else playing a game, right? 15%. And that was overwhelmingly 12 to 24.
Right.
So this year, 1 year later, it's exactly the same percentage, 15%, overwhelmingly 12 to 24.
I thought you were going to give me some kind of good number, but you're not. It's just the same.
It's like from the perspective of the percentage of humans who want to actually watch this and participate in esports, it hasn't grown as far as I can see. So that's number one. Number two, it is very firmly entrenched 12 to 24, maybe 12 to 29, and heavily male. And while video games can appeal, I play all kinds of video games, but the appeal of actually watching esports is focused on a fairly targeted niche, let's say. So expecting to grow beyond that, I think, is kind of facts, not an evidence. And then there, boy, a couple more things. Number three, it's only been a few months. Like, give it a time. Like, it's could actually blossom into something a year from now or 2 years from now. But we are just getting used to not having sports, right? And the thought that all of a sudden, if pizza has been taken away, we'll just start eating Brussels sprouts, I'm not sure. But if we don't have pizza for 3 years, maybe I'll begin to love Brussels sprouts. So we're expecting a lot out of a few months. And then the final thing I'll say about this is that the esports, especially the kind of virtual racing world in the past 3 months, has stumbled badly. They've had the stage all to themselves, and there has been scandal after scandal. There was a cheating scandal where a Formula One racer actually hired a ringer who was a professional esports player to take his place in an F1 race. We've had a NASCAR driver drop racial epithets in an esports competition.
No.
We've had a sabotage and accidents in another virtual F1 race that, one of the players blamed on his bad connection, and the other one clearly was doing it for belligerent reasons. And you've got all of these things that show to me that esports at that level for the general populace, beyond the kind of younger male segment of the population, is not quite ready for prime time.
Wow, that is a lot to unpack, because it's just like there's so many considerations that you don't really take into account when you're thinking about, well, we've got esports, they can play it. We don't need to worry about quarantine around it. Let's just have it happen. But there's so many ways that it can just go off the cliff. Tim, what's your thoughts on the whole situation? I mean, esports as a whole is an interesting opportunity for a lot of brands to connect with a really, I guess, well-connected, as the best way to say it, maybe highly disposable income audience, somebody who's very desirable for a lot of the brands to get in touch with. Yet one of the complaints they said was that it doesn't reach the same audience. Does that really matter that much? I mean, it's like, just because it's 12 to 24-year-olds, I mean, so the beer sponsors can't get involved with it, but it doesn't mean you can't, some of the other sponsors can't come on board. Do you see any other roadblocks that would keep esports from maybe getting a little bit more traction with more brands around the country?
Well, I don't think it's. I do think it's hard to suggest that esports is a perfect replacement for live real sports. I don't think it's that easy. That statistic that Tom shared was pretty shocking. I didn't realize they'd gone a year without any sort of improvement in that number, which is kind of scary. I don't, from my point of view, I'm a gamer. I enjoy playing video games. I don't particularly enjoy watching people playing video games. So, I mean, just I think a lot of the folks in my age bracket who have their reins on ad budgets, I think perhaps it's still sort of a foreign thing. I do think it's hard to expect brands to suddenly, particularly in this environment, start to innovate and experiment with their budgets for esports. I've covered a bunch of interesting creative moves that agencies have done around esports, and I think one of them was in Finland, where the hockey season the playoffs were completed, but the teams sort of within, I think, the NHL, the EA game for NHL. I think the Finnish Hockey League sort of finished their game in there, and I thought that was really cool. And then I read on I think it was Fox Sports. I get their daily sports email, and I think there was like a horse game that some NBA players were doing, and that was already feeling tired to people. So I think honestly the energy and the built-in brand equity around live sports, I mean, esports is just an absolute tiny fraction of that. So to expect brands to suddenly see it as similar to live sports, I think is just not true at the moment. But I think we're looking at years before brands really catch on to this, and maybe they won't fully catch on. Maybe it will remain kind of a niche thing. But I do think esports leagues fail to sort of take the opportunity that this quarantine and the lack of live sports is offering them. I think that'll be certainly a missed opportunity for them.
Well, with that, it's time for this week's Fair, Fail, Foul. But before we get to that segment of the show, I do want to take this quick opportunity to thank my guests again and allow them to each do a shameless plug, starting with Tim Nudd. You can find him at Muse by Clio, which is musebycl.io. Really great URL. I know I make a big deal about it every single time, but it's such a great URL. Tell us what's going on in your world, Tim. What would you like to promote?
Well, we're just, we're covering creativity daily on Muse. You can also get to it at musebyclio.com if you don't like that .io. And we're actually launching a new video series this week. We're going to be talking to CMOs about getting through COVID and how they value creativity. It's called On Brand, and our first episode, I think, will drop on Thursday this week. So Thursday afternoons at 4, we're going to be doing that. So come check it out.
Sounds great. Next up, we have Tamsen Webster. You can find her at tamsenwebster.com. That's the home of all things Red Thread related. Tell us what's going on in your world, Tamsen. What would you like to promote?
Oh, there's so many things. I think the best place, as usual, is just tamsenwebster.com/newsletter, where I kind of try to give practical tips every week to how to actually make your message stronger and to make your ideas strong enough to build on.
That's great. And getting a newsletter from Tamsen Webster, I can think of a whole lot worse things to happen. This is a fantastic way to get a great amount of information from a really smart consultant out there. Last but not least, Tom Webster. It says Tim on my script, so of course I read it like that. Tom Webster, you can find him at edisonresearch.com. And Tom, what would you like to promote?
Well, besides all of the continual research that we're putting out at edisonresearch.com, I started a newsletter about a month ago about all things digital audio, from podcasting to streaming to audiobooks, anything you can listen to, called I Hear Things. And that's at tomwebster.substack.com.
That sounds fascinating. I'll have to check that out. As for me, for more information about me or the show, visit thebeancast.com. There you can find a complete show archive. You can find out how to consult with me about getting your brand's podcasts off the ground. And you can even find out how to advertise on this program. So check it all out at thebeancast.com. And now it's time for this week's Fair, Fail, Foul, a rundown of the best and worst of advertising, marketing, and public relations from the last week. I'm going to start with the fair as usual, Tamsen, and I love this ad. I don't know why. I mean, I was particularly enamored with this week. There was this literacy ad. It offered a clever design that created a compelling engagement with the message. Basically, what they did was they took this statement, 18% of New York adults don't know how to read, and they crafted it into a message that was readable, still compelling, but was not completely readable. You had to really struggle to understand it, but for some reason, it was so compelling, it drew you in and made you want to read it and try to figure it out. It was done by, let me see, I have this down, in partnership for Literacy Partners, Literacy Partners being the nonprofit in New York that's doing this particular ad campaign. What were your thoughts about this? Did you like this as much as I did?
I love anything that helps put people in some proximal position to the people that we're trying to give more information about. I mean, I think the idea of just try to, I mean, we all, the message is always like, walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, but that it's so rare that you can actually do that. And so I think when there's an opportunity like this to not only create an experience that helps someone truly understand what it's like to almost understand something, but not quite, or at least the difficulty that's inherent in that. At the same time, opening that kind of curiosity gap where somebody looks at that and goes, okay, I can read it. It's hard to read, but why can't I read it? What are they trying to say? I'm 100% with you. I think it was a masterful ad on a couple different levels.
I'm glad to know that I'm not alone with that, because it really was pretty fantastic. Well, the fail of this week goes to McCann's M United. And Tim, you've probably covered this or talked about it or seen the many, many stories about this one, but M United solicited Black Lives Matter murals for the Microsoft store on Fifth Avenue. The Microsoft store was covered up with a lot of boarding because of the protests, and they were trying to get some kind of Black Lives Matter murals painted on these boardings so that people would be greeted with a message of support. But the way it was framed to the black artists that were approached was, we're trying to get this done very quickly while the issue is still relevant. This one got a lot of traction. Now, luckily, the person who posted it and made a big deal about it just blamed the agency and redacted anything in connection with the individual who sent the email. So at least that is not part of this story. But this is just another example, in my opinion, of what Tamsen was saying. It's systemic. It goes everywhere. People just don't know what to say, do, act, speak, whatever.
Totally. I mean, this was a ridiculous email. And I think, that to me, again, the important point here is, like, I think maybe once upon a time I might have sort of given this person the benefit of the doubt and said, well, it was poorly worded. Maybe they didn't mean it. And today I think, no, like, do better. This perpetuates racism, and you can and should do better. And I'm glad that McCann and Microsoft were embarrassed by this. They should have been, and it's unacceptable. So there's upsides to this. Again, it's calling people out, and people need to be called out, and they need to do better.
Well, the foul of the week, Tom, goes to Tim Hortons. Tim Hortons apparently has been tracking every single location stop that anybody who has their app has made since installing this thing. So this app has been logging longitude and latitude for everywhere you've been. Even if you opted out of certain tracking features, according to the company, now that they've been exposed on this, that it's different on every device, and some devices you could turn it off more easily than others. The reporter who wrote this said that he was tracked in 3 months, going to 2,700 locations, tracked 2,700 times. They know so much about him. This seems like an egregious use of location tracking to me. Am I just being a little bit oversensitive about this?
I don't think you're being oversensitive. I mean, Tim Hortons is by far not the only entity doing this. I mean, if you many of the media apps that you might listen to, streaming audio apps, if you walk into a Home Depot, they know that you're in the plywood aisle. The amount that this is done would probably horrify a lot of people, but we all click the terms of service. So I don't think Tim Hortons is any worse or better. This is not to excuse them than so many of those other apps.
But so many of the apps, when they go to install, make that request, do you want it to be tracking you while all the time or just when the app is open? So there's this assumption that when the app is closed, it's not tracking you. But apparently this was still tracking.
Well, yeah. And I think a lot of that is just things are not being regulated very well. And, we've certainly seen this week that Google's Chrome incognito is also not as incognito as we thought.
Right.
So this stuff is all very sinister, and I don't want to end the show on a downer of a note, Bob. So I'll leave you with this. Tim Hortons. This is a true story, named after the great hockey player Tim Horton from the Toronto Maple Leafs. And you would think it would be Tim Hortons 'S because it's Tim Hortons donut shop. But when they wanted to expand into Montreal, there's no such thing as 'S in French. It would have to be Le Restaurant au Tim Horton, and they would have had to have changed their branding. And so they just deleted the apostrophe. So there you go. Tim Hortons.
So that is something I did not know. And so that is wrong in my script as well. And I will keep that in mind for future programs. Well, have a suggestion for this list or just want to discuss it, comment online, use the hashtag FairFailFoul. That's pound fair fail foul. And that does it for this week's episode. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, visit our website at thebeancast.com and click on the subscribe link. If you're an Apple Podcast listener, we've also provided a direct link to our listing there, or just search for the BeanCast in the podcast directory on the Apple Podcasts app. And whichever podcast directory you use, when you subscribe, please leave us a review. Got a comment? Have a question? We'd love to hear from you. Just send your emails to beancast@gmail.com. Opening theme was performed by Joe Seibel. Closing theme by C. Jax. Thanks for listening. I'm Bob Norp. We'll be back again next week. Hope you'll join us then.
You know what I mean? It's like if it's, you know what I mean? I don't know, man. It's just like, okay, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like totally like that. It's like, I don't know, like if it's, you know, it's like, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's just like kind of, it just seems like it's just like almost exactly. It's like exactly. Yeah. You know what I mean? Exactly.
Cool beans.